The proposition was, at its heart, an act of supreme desperation. King Edward of the Evernight, sovereign of the shadowed spires and the crimson rivers, sat alone in the vast silence of his study and considered the merits of a lie. For 6 days now the pressure had been a physical thing, a tightening in his chest like a suit of armor worn one size too small. The Royal Council, a parliament of ancient vampires with veins like withered roots and ambition as cold as crypt stone, had delivered their ultimatum. A marriage. A political alliance with the northern houses, cemented by a union with Lady Seraphina, a woman Edward had only ever seen in a series of oil paintings, each one colder and more lifeless than the last. Her painted eyes held the flat, glassy sheen of a predator staring at property. The thought of binding his eternity to hers was a kind of death he had not yet experienced. He pushed the latest portrait away, the gilded frame scraping against the polished obsidian of his desk. The room was a cage of shadows and moonlight, the tall arched windows showing a sky bruised with the deep purple of a coming dawn. Outside, the city of Nocturne slept, but here, in the heart of the royal spire, duty was a sleepless predator. He could feel the weight of his crown even though it sat on a velvet cushion across the room, its silver points like teeth in the dim light. It was a weight in his bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He was a king, yes, but he was also a prisoner, shackled to a throne he had never asked for. "They will not relent, Your Majesty," a voice said, soft as dust settling on a forgotten tomb. Alistair, his chamberlain and the closest thing he had to a friend, stepped from the shadows near the door. His face was a roadmap of centuries. His posture stooped not from age, but from a lifetime of carrying secrets. He held a silver tray with a single crystal goblet, filled with the dark, ruby-red vintage Edward favored. Edward didn't look at it. The thought of feeding felt like just another chore. "They speak of stability, of strengthening our bloodlines," Edward murmured, his voice rough from disuse. "What they mean is power. Valerius wants his hand on the northern trade routes. Isolde wants her niece in the palace. It has nothing to do with me." "It is never about the man, Your Majesty," Alistair said, his tone gentle but unsparing. "Only the crown he wears." He placed the goblet on the desk. "The Blood Moon Ball is in 3 weeks. They expect you to announce your betrothal then. Lord Valerius has already begun drafting the marriage contracts." Edward finally looked up, and the exhaustion in his ancient eyes was profound. "Then I am out of time." He ran a hand through his dark hair, the gesture utterly human, utterly weary. "I will not do it, Alistair. I will not chain myself to a political maneuver. This isn't a life, it's a transaction." Alistair was silent for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful. He moved to the window, looking down at the sleeping city below. "Then perhaps," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "we must engage in a transaction of our own." Edward frowned. "What are you suggesting?" "The council desires a union. They desire the appearance of stability, of a king settling his future. They believe you are adrift, unmoored. A queen, they think, will be an anchor." Alistair turned back, his dark eyes shrewd. "But the contract does not specify which queen. Not yet." A seed of an idea began to form in the barren landscape of Edward's mind. "You mean I should find my own candidate? Another highborn lady to pit against Seraphina? It would only delay the inevitable. The houses would go to war over the insult." "No," Alistair said, a rare, sly hint of a smile touching his thin lips. "Not a highborn lady. Not a political asset at all. I am suggesting a diversion, a story, a romance so sudden, so compelling that it disrupts their plans entirely." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "You arrive at the Blood Moon Ball with a woman on your arm. A woman no one knows. A mysterious noble from a distant, forgotten bloodline. You are utterly besotted. In love. The council cannot force you to break a love match for a political one without looking like tyrants. It would buy you time. Months, perhaps even a year. Edward stared at him, the audacity of the plan a sudden shock to his system. A lie, he breathed. You want me to stage a courtship? I want you to protect your crown and your sanity, Alastair corrected gently. It would require an actress of considerable skill, someone believable, someone who would not be recognized, and someone who would not be a threat. Someone who would understand the terms and disappear when her role is complete. The king leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning in protest. The idea was mad. It was reckless. It was a deception on a scale that could shatter the fragile peace of his court. But it was also a lifeline. A sliver of possibility in a future that had felt like a sealed crypt. And where would we find such a paragon of theatrical talent and discretion? He asked, the sarcasm in his voice thin and brittle. Alastair's gaze did not waver. There is a tavern in the lower district, the Crimson Mug, a place of no consequence. I frequent it sometimes to listen to the pulse of the city. He hesitated. There is a waitress there. Her name is Anne. She has a quiet dignity about her, a resilience. She carries herself with a grace that does not belong in such a place. He looked directly at Edward. And I have heard whispers. She is in need. Her younger brother is ill. The treatments are expensive. Desperation, Your Majesty, can be a powerful motivator. And it ensures loyalty for a price. Edward considered this. A commoner. A waitress. The risk was monumental. But the reward was freedom. Time. A breath of air in a room that was slowly suffocating him. He looked at the cold, painted face of Lady Seraphina, then at the empty goblet on his desk. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of something other than resignation stirred within him. It felt like hope, but it was sharper, more dangerous. It was the thrill of a gamble. Find her, he said, his voice firm, the decision made. Bring her to me. We will see if she can play the part of a queen. The air in the Crimson Mug was thick with the metallic tang of cheap blood ale and the smell of damp stone and regret. It clung to Anne's clothes, her hair, the weary lines around her eyes. She moved through the boisterous crowd with an economy of motion born of long practice, her tray held high, her expression a careful mask of neutrality. Another shift was ending, the darkness outside finally deepening to the true black of the hours before dawn. Her feet ached, a dull, persistent throb that had become a familiar companion. Her back was a knot of tension. But it was the ache in her chest that was the heaviest. Every coin she earned, every drop of spilled ale she wiped from the scarred wooden tables, was for Leo, her brother. His cough had been worse this week, a dry, rattling sound that echoed the fragility of his waning life. The apothecary's tinctures were a drain, a constant sucking wound in her meager earnings. The specialist in the upper city had mentioned a new treatment, a transfusion of purer, older blood that might bolster his strength, but the cost was astronomical. It was a sum so vast she couldn't even properly imagine it, a mountain she could never hope to climb. So she worked, and she worried, and she pasted a polite smile on her face for patrons who saw her as nothing more than a pair of hands to bring them their next drink. She was clearing the last of the mugs when the tavern fell silent. It was not a gradual quieting, but a sudden, sharp cessation of all noise, as if a giant hand had clapped over the mouth of the room. The raucous laughter, the drunken arguments, the clatter of mugs, all gone. Anne looked up, her hand frozen in midair. Framed in the doorway were two figures. The first was an older vampire, impeccably dressed, his posture radiating an authority that felt ancient and absolute. But it was the man behind him who had stolen the breath from every patron in the room. He was tall, dressed in the severe, elegant black of the highest nobility, and he carried the night with him like a cloak. There was a stillness about him, a coiled intensity that made the very air around him seem to hum. It was King Edward, here, in her tavern. An impossibility. The crowd seemed to shrink, to fold in on itself. Vampires who had been brawling moments before were now staring into their mugs as if they held the secrets of the universe. Anne's heart, a slow, steady, mostly forgotten muscle, gave a painful lurch. The king's gaze swept the room, cool and assessing, before it landed on her. For a terrifying second, she thought she had done something wrong, that some unknown transgression had brought the wrath of the throne down upon this humble, grimy establishment. The older vampire, the Chamberlain, stepped forward. "We are looking for a woman named Anne," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent room. Anne felt 100 pairs of eyes turn to her. She swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. She wiped her hands on her apron, a nervous, reflexive gesture. "I am Anne," she said, her own voice sounding small and thin. The Chamberlain nodded. "His Majesty requests a private word." It was not a request. They were led to the tavern owner's cramped, dusty office, a space that smelled of stale ledgers and cheap incense. The owner himself had all but melted into the floorboards, bowing so low his forehead nearly touched his knees. Once inside, the Chamberlain closed the door, and the muffled sounds of the tavern disappeared, leaving a silence that was even more profound. The king stood by the room's single grimy window, looking out at the dark alleyway. He hadn't spoken a word. He seemed tired. The weight of his presence was immense, but there was a fragility in his posture that she hadn't expected. "My name is Alistair," the Chamberlain said, turning to her. "This is a delicate matter, and I must ask for your complete discretion." He paused, his eyes searching her face. "We have a proposition for you. A temporary role to play. It would require you to accompany His Majesty to the upcoming Blood Moon Ball." Anne stared at him, bewildered. "A role? I don't understand. I'm a waitress." "Precisely," Alistair said. "You are unknown, unconnected. That is your primary asset." The king finally turned from the window. His eyes were a startlingly clear, pale gray, like a winter sky, and they held a deep, ancient sadness. "I require a companion for the evening," he said, his voice a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the small room. "Someone who can portray my paramour, my betrothed." Anne's jaw nearly dropped. This was beyond madness. "You want me to pretend to be your fiancé? Why?" "My reasons are my own," the king said, his tone clipped and formal. "They are matters of state. Your role would be to attend the ball, to appear devoted to me, and to convince my court that our connection is genuine. In return for this one night of service, you will be compensated." Alistair slid a heavy velvet pouch across the desk. The clink of coins was deep and resonant. "This is an advance. The full sum will be paid upon the successful completion of your duties. It is enough," he added, his gaze pointed, "to secure the finest medical care in the city for many years to come." The breath left Anne's body in a rush. The finest medical care. For Leo, the mountain she could never climb, a path had just been cleared to its summit. But the cost was this insane, terrifying masquerade. To stand beside the king, to lie to the entire vampire aristocracy, she could be executed for less. She looked from Alistair's shrewd face to the king's impassive one. She saw the cool command in his eyes, but beneath it, she saw something else. The same thing she had seen in her own reflection many times. Desperation. He was trapped, just as she was. Their cages were made of different materials, his of gold and expectation, hers of poverty and fear. But they were cages nonetheless. "Why me?" she asked, the question a genuine whisper. Edward's gaze softened for a fraction of a second. "Alistair believes you possess a certain authenticity, that you are a poor liar, and therefore, if you commit to a lie, you will be utterly convincing." It was a strange, backhanded compliment, but it struck a chord of truth. Anne thought of Leo, of his pale face, his rattling breath. She thought of the endless nights of work, the bone-deep weariness, the hopelessness that was her constant companion. This was a risk, a terrible, life-altering risk. But what was her life, truly? A slow, grinding march toward losing the only person she had ever loved? This offer wasn't just money. It was a chance. It was hope, wrapped in a terrifying disguise. She reached out and placed her hand on the velvet pouch. The weight of the gold was real, solid, tangible. She looked the King of the Evernight in the eye. "I accept," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Tell me what I need to do." The lessons took place in a disused wing of the palace, a series of rooms draped in dust cloths and smelling of faded potpourri and thyme. It was a liminal space, belonging neither to the public grandeur of the staterooms nor the private reality of the royal chambers. It was a stage, and Anne was its sole, bewildered actress. Alistair was her director, a patient, exacting tutor in the arcane arts of being noble. She learned how to walk, not with the hurried efficiency of a waitress, but with a slow, deliberate glide that suggested she had never been in a hurry in her life. She learned how to sit, how to rise, how to hold a goblet of blood as if it were an extension of her own hand. She learned the intricate genealogies of the great houses, memorizing names and alliances until her head spun. She was given a new identity, Lady Annalise of the Shadowfen, the last scion of a reclusive and ancient bloodline from the fog-shrouded southern marshes. The story was detailed, plausible, and felt as foreign on her tongue as a forgotten language. Edward was a remote, professional presence during these sessions. He would observe for an hour each day, his expression unreadable, his posture rigid. He corrected her pronunciation of a particular surname, demonstrated the precise angle of a formal bow, his movements fluid and economical. He was the king, and she was his employee. The arrangement was clear, boundaries starkly drawn. He was paying for a performance, and he expected perfection. Yet sometimes the facade would crack. During a lesson on courtly conversation, Alistair instructed her to engage the king in light, meaningless chatter. She was supposed to inquire about his hunting prospects or the quality of the season's vintage. Instead, feeling a flash of her usual tavern-honed impertinence, she asked, "Does your crown ever make your head itch?" Alistair froze, horrified, but Edward, after a beat of stunned silence, let out a short, sharp sound that was almost a laugh. A muscle twitched at the corner of his mouth. "Constantly," he admitted, the word a small conspiracy between them. The moment passed, the professional mask snapping back into place, but Anne had seen him. The man, not the monarch. The most difficult lesson was the waltz. Anne had never danced, not really. The king was meant to be her partner, to guide her through the steps in preparation for the ball. The first attempt was a disaster. She was stiff, clumsy, her body coiled with the tension of being in such close proximity to him. She trod on his immaculate boots twice. "You are thinking too much," he said, his voice a low murmur near her ear. His hand was a cool, firm pressure on the small of her back. "You are trying to remember the steps. Just feel the music." "It's a bit difficult to feel the music when you're terrified of breaking the king's toes," she retorted, her breath catching. He stopped, looking down at her. In the muted light of the dusty room, she could see the fine, silver threads at his temples, the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes. He seemed impossibly old and terribly young all at once. "I assure you, my toes are quite resilient," he said, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Try again. Don't watch your feet. Watch me." He raised their joined hands, repositioned his hand on her back, and began to move. This time, she did as he said. She stopped thinking about the steps, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and focused on his eyes. They were her anchor in a swirling sea of anxiety. He led and she followed, her body finally relaxing, responding to his subtle guidance. They moved together, a slow, graceful orbit in the silent, forgotten room. The dust motes danced in the shafts of light from the high windows, and for a few minutes there was no king, no waitress, no lie. There were only two people, moving to a silent rhythm. He spun her out, then drew her back in. The motion was faster than she expected, and she stumbled, her balance lost. She gasped, expecting to fall, but his arm tightened around her waist, catching her, holding her securely against him. Her hand landed flat against the starched fabric of his tunic, and she could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. It was a quiet, thrumming rhythm, a sign of life in the marble statue of a king. They stood frozen for a long second, closer than they had ever been. She could feel the faint warmth radiating from him, smell the clean, cold scent of night air and old parchment that clung to his clothes. She looked up and found him already looking at her, his gray eyes wide with a surprise that mirrored her own. In their depths, she saw not the remote monarch or the exacting employer, but a profound, aching loneliness. It was a look she recognized. It was a look she had seen in her own mirror. He released her abruptly, stepping back. The space between them felt cold, charged with an unspoken energy. "The lesson is over for today," he said, his voice once again formal, distant. He turned and walked out of the room without another word, leaving Anne standing alone in the center of the floor, her hand still tingling from the ghost of his heartbeat. Alastair cleared his throat, a quiet, knowing sound in the sudden silence. The rehearsal was over, but something new, something unplanned and far more dangerous, had just begun. The night of the Blood Moon Ball arrived like a verdict. Anne stood before a full-length mirror in the opulent suite she'd been given, a stranger staring back at her. The woman in the reflection wore a gown the color of spilled wine, a cascade of crimson silk and black lace that shimmered with every breath. Her hair, usually tied back in a practical knot, was a dark, intricate coronet of braids woven with tiny, glittering rubies that looked like drops of blood. Her face was pale, her lips stained a deep berry red. She was beautiful. She was terrifying. She was Lady Annalise of the Shadowfen. She was a lie, spun from silk and desperation. A nervous tremor ran through her hands, and she clasped them together, trying to still their shaking. This was not the familiar anxiety of a busy night at the tavern, or the gnawing worry over Leo's health. This was a deeper, colder fear. The fear of exposure. The fear of being seen for what she truly was, an imposter, a commoner playing dress-up in a world that would chew her up and spit her out without a second thought. She was an actor about to step onto a stage, but the audience was a pack of wolves, and she had forgotten all her lines. There was a soft knock on the door. "It is time," Alastair's voice called. She took one last, deep breath, trying to draw on some hidden reserve of courage. She thought of Leo, of the future this night would buy for him. That was real. That was her anchor. She opened the door. Edward was waiting in the corridor. He was dressed in formal black, a severe, high-collared tunic embroidered with silver thread that traced the patterns of constellations. The crown of the Evernight rested on his dark hair, its silver points gleaming. He was no longer the tired man from the rehearsal room. He was every inch the king, a figure of immense power and breathtaking authority. When he saw her, he stopped. His cool, gray eyes widened almost imperceptibly, and they traveled the length of her, from the jewels in her hair to the hem of her gown. For a moment, all the air seemed to leave the corridor. "You look," he began, his voice a low murmur. Then he seemed to catch himself. He cleared his throat. "The presentation is adequate." Anne almost smiled. It was the most Edward-like compliment she could have imagined. He extended his arm, the gesture formal, rehearsed. She placed her hand on his forearm. His touch was cool through the fine fabric of his tunic, but it was steady, solid. As her fingers curled around his arm, she felt a small measure of his tension, a rigid control beneath the surface. He was as nervous as she was. The realization was a strange comfort. It made them partners in this grand deception, not just employer and employee. They walked in silence through the marble halls, their footsteps echoing in the vast, empty spaces. But as they neared the grand ballroom, the silence was replaced by a rising tide of sound, the soaring notes of a string quartet, the murmur of hundreds of voices, the clinking of crystal. The gilded doors to the ballroom stood open, a brilliant maw of golden light and noise. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low, for her ears only. "No," she whispered back with brutal honesty. "Are you?" A faint smile touched his lips. "No." He took a breath, and she felt his posture straighten, his regal mask clicking firmly into place. On instinct, an impulse she couldn't explain, she squeezed his arm. It was a small, unplanned gesture, a flicker of genuine support in a sea of artifice. He glanced down at her, his eyes surprised. And in them, for a fleeting second, she saw a flicker of something she could only describe as gratitude. Then, they stepped through the doors and into the light. The ballroom was a breathtaking assault on the senses. The ceiling was a dome of painted stars, and from its center hung a chandelier of black iron and 1,000 shimmering crystals, each one catching the light like a trapped soul. The air was heavy with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and the expensive, cloying perfume of ancient bloodlines. A river of vampires flowed through the room, a dazzling display of silks, velvets, and jewels in every shade of black, crimson, and midnight blue. And as they entered, the river parted. The music faltered for a beat. The hum of conversation dipped. Every head turned. Every pair of ancient, predatory eyes fixed on them. On her. The weight of their collective gaze was a physical blow, and Anne felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crumble. Her hand tightened on Edward's arm, her knuckles white. He leaned in, his lips brushing her ear, his voice a warm, steadying presence. "They are just people, Annalise," he murmured, using her fake name for the first time. It sounded strange, foreign, yet his saying it made it feel, for a moment, real. Vain, ambitious, and easily distracted by shiny things. "Smile as if you own them all. You have a right to be here. You are with me." His words were a shield. She lifted her chin, summoning the ghost of a confident smile she'd practiced in the mirror. They began to move through the room, a slow procession toward the dais where the royal thrones sat. Names and faces swam before her eyes. Duke Valerius, his face a mask of cold fury barely concealed beneath a veneer of courtly politeness. Duchess Isolde, her eyes like chips of ice, assessing Anne as if she were a horse she was considering buying. They bowed, they curtsied, they offered platitudes dripping with venom, and through it all Edward was a constant, solid presence at her side. His hand rested lightly on her back, guiding her, protecting her. He introduced her with a possessive pride that felt shockingly real, his voice smooth and certain. "Duke Valerius, may I present Lady Annalise of the Shadowfen, my betrothed." The word hung in the air, a stone thrown into a silent pool, its ripples spreading through the entire court. The performance had begun, and there was no turning back. Edward led her to the dance floor as the orchestra swelled, beginning a waltz. This was the centerpiece of their performance, the public declaration. He had expected the execution of a well-rehearsed plan. He would hold her at a respectable distance, they would exchange the scripted lines of affection they had memorized, and they would present a convincing, if passionless, portrait of a royal union. He was prepared for the mechanics of the lie. He was not prepared for Anne. He took her in his arms, one hand on her waist, the other clasping hers. She felt small and delicate against him, yet there was a wiry strength in her frame, a resilience he was beginning to recognize. The scent of her, not the heavy perfumes of the court ladies, but something subtle, like night air and wild herbs, was a startling, pleasant distraction. They began to move, their steps falling into the familiar rhythm from their practice sessions. He guided her through the turns, his movements precise and controlled. He was the king, performing a duty. But then she looked up at him, and the carefully constructed walls around his heart began to tremble. Her eyes, a warm, deep brown that seemed to absorb the light, were wide with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. There was no artifice in them, no noble hauteur. There was only Anne, a waitress from the lower district, dancing with her king in a room full of their enemies. And she was magnificent. "Try not to look so much like you're facing a firing squad, Your Majesty," she murmured, her voice a low, private joke in the midst of the public spectacle. "It's supposed to be a happy occasion." He was so startled by her candor that he almost missed a step. He had expected her to whisper one of their rehearsed lines, something about the stars in his eyes or the strength of his arms. Instead, she had offered him a jest, a small, sharp pinprick of reality in the bloated balloon of courtly pretense. A sound rumbled in his chest, a foreign, rusty thing. It was a laugh. He choked it back, but the ghost of it remained in his eyes, a flicker of warmth that he knew the watching council members would misinterpret as amorous delight. "I am simply overwhelmed by your beauty, my lady," he replied, his voice smooth as silk, playing his part. But as he said the words, he found they were not entirely a lie. She was beautiful, but it was not the cold, statuesque beauty of the high-born ladies. It was a living, breathing beauty, a vibrancy that shone from within. It was in the faint flush on her cheeks, the spark of humor in her eyes, the determined set of her jaw. They continued to dance, a silent orbit in the center of the glittering galaxy of the court. He was acutely aware of the eyes on them, particularly the cold, calculating gaze of Lord Valerius. He knew he should be focused on the political implications, on the success of their ruse, but his focus had narrowed to the woman in his arms. He watched the way the crimson jewels in her hair caught the light as she turned. He noticed the slight, nervous tremor in the hand he held, and he tightened his grip, a reflexive, protective gesture. They were supposed to be performing, but the performance felt less and less like acting. The lines between the role and the reality were blurring, dissolving in the heat of the ballroom, and the surprising, undeniable connection he felt with her. "The Duchess Isolde looks as though she's just swallowed a lemon," Anne whispered, her eyes twinkling with mischief as they swept past the glowering Duchess. "She is perpetually chewing on a lemon," Edward whispered back, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Anne's quiet laugh was a melody only he could hear, and it struck him with the force of a physical blow. When was the last time he had shared a genuine moment of humor with anyone? When was the last time he had felt anything other than the crushing weight of his obligations? He was not performing anymore. He was not the king, and she was not the hired actress. He was just a man, dancing with a woman whose wit was as sharp as her eyes were kind. A woman who, in the space of a single dance, had made him feel more real than he had in a century. The waltz ended, but he was reluctant to let her go. He held her for a moment longer than was strictly proper, his hand lingering on her waist. The court would see it as a sign of his deep affection. He knew, with a terrifying certainty, that it was simply the truth. He looked down at her, and the world, the music, the crowd, the political machinations, faded away until there was only her face, her eyes looking up at him with a question she did not dare to ask. The lie they had so carefully constructed was becoming dangerously, beautifully real. The heat and noise of the ballroom became oppressive, a gilded cage tightening around them. Edward could feel the probing stares, hear the whispered speculations. He needed a moment of quiet, a breath of air that wasn't thick with perfume and intrigue. More than that, he needed to escape the performance, to see if the woman he'd just danced with was real, or if she too was a creation of the candlelight and music. "Come with me," he murmured, his hand finding the small of her back again. He guided her through a set of tall glass doors that led onto a deserted balcony. The cool night air was an immediate relief. The manicured royal gardens spread out below them, a tapestry of silver-leafed trees and pale moon-fed flowers, their scent rising on the breeze. The distant sounds of the ball were a muted murmur, a world away. Here, under the light of the full moon, the artifice fell away. Anne walked to the stone balustrade and leaned against it, closing her eyes for a moment as if to steady herself. The crimson of her dress was a stark, beautiful slash of color against the pale stone and the deep shadows. "I don't think I've ever been so terrified in my life," she confessed, her voice soft, stripped of the practiced confidence of Lady Annalise. "I kept waiting for someone to point at me and shout that my dress was rented and my jewels were fake." "The jewels are real," Edward said, moving to stand beside her. He kept a respectful distance, but he could feel the warmth of her, a stark contrast to the cold stone. "And no one would dare." "They would if they knew the truth." She looked at him, her expression vulnerable. "Thank you. In there, you were a very good anchor." "We are partners in this deception," he said, though the words felt hollow now. This felt like something else entirely. "It is in my best interest to ensure you do not drown." He paused, then added, his voice quieter. "You were magnificent." A small, genuine smile touched her lips. "I was mostly just trying not to trip over my own feet, or your titles." She looked out over the gardens, a wistful expression on her face. "It's beautiful, all of it, but it doesn't feel real. It feels like a story someone else is living." "It often feels that way to me, too," he admitted, the confession startling him with its honesty. He never spoke of this, of the profound, crushing loneliness of his position. The crown was a wall between him and the world. "I am not a person. I am an institution, a symbol. My desires are irrelevant. My future is a matter for committee meetings and trade agreements." She turned to him, her gaze direct and surprisingly empathetic. "That sounds terribly lonely." He was taken aback by the simple, profound understanding in her words. No one ever spoke to him of loneliness. They spoke of duty, legacy, power. She saw the man in the cage. "It is," he said simply. The admission hung between them, a fragile, trembling thing. To fill the silence, he asked, "Alistair told me about your brother, Leo." Her entire being softened at the mention of the name. A fierce, protective light came into her eyes. He's everything. He's brilliant. He loves books, old maps. He wants to be a scholar. He sees the world with such wonder. She looked down at her hands, which were twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. This sickness, it's stealing that from him. It's making his world smaller and smaller. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "The money you gave me, it's not just for medicine, it's for him. It's for his wonder. So thank you." Edward was humbled by the raw, powerful love in her voice. It was an emotion so pure, so selfless, it felt like a foreign concept in his world of calculated alliances and veiled threats. He had wielded power his entire life, commanded armies, shaped nations. But he had never encountered anything as formidable as this woman's love for her brother. "What did you want to be?" she asked suddenly, her question cutting through his thoughts. "Before all this, before you were king, when you were just Edward." The question stunned him into silence. No one had ever asked him that. No one had ever conceived of him as just Edward. He searched the long, lonely corridors of his memory. I don't remember, he confessed, and the truth of it was a cold, hollow ache in his chest. I have been heir to the throne since my creation. There was never an before. The sadness of his own answer settled over them. The charade was forgotten. The ball, the council, the lie, all of it faded into the background. Here on this moonlit balcony, they were just two people, sharing a moment of unexpected, terrifying vulnerability. A gust of wind swept across the balcony, and a loose strand of her dark hair blew across her face. Without thinking, without conscious thought at all, he reached out. His intention was simple, to tuck the stray lock behind her ear. But as his fingers brushed against the soft skin of her cheek, a jolt went through him, a spark of warmth and life that was utterly overwhelming. It was a simple, human touch, but it felt more profound than any royal decree, more real than any crown. She flinched, not in fear, but in surprise. Her eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. He saw his own shock reflected in their dark depths. The air crackled between them, thick with unspoken things. He snatched his hand back as if burned, and she took a half step away. The spell was broken. The distance returned, colder and wider than before, because now they both knew what it felt like to cross it. The charade was not just shattered, it was irrelevant. Something real had happened between them, something that had no place in their contract, and they were both utterly terrified of it. The rest of the ball passed in a blur of forced smiles and hollow pleasantries. Edward escorted Anne back to her suite, the silence between them a heavy, humming thing. At her door, they exchanged stilted, formal goodbyes. The contract was fulfilled. The performance was over. He walked back to his own chambers through the echoing, empty halls of the palace, the applause of the court still ringing in his ears. The plan had been a resounding success. The council was, for the moment, placated. Lord Valerius was furious, but impotent. Edward had won. So why did he feel so utterly, devastatingly empty? He stood in the center of his vast, silent bedchamber, the crown still on his head, feeling its weight more acutely than ever. He had been surrounded by hundreds of his subjects, had played the part of the smitten lover, had secured a victory for his own autonomy. But the only moment that felt real, the only moment that mattered, was the one on the balcony. The honesty in her voice when she spoke of her brother. The startling empathy in her eyes when she had called him lonely. The electric shock of his fingers against her skin. He had hired her to be a fiction, a beautiful lie to distract his court. But somewhere between the first step of the waltz and the last shared silence on the balcony, she had become the only truth in his world. The palace, once a symbol of his power, now felt like a mausoleum. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was deafening. It was the sound of her absence. He could not go back to the way things were. The memory of her warmth, her humor, her startling realness had ruined him for the cold, empty solitude he had called a life. For Anne, the return to her own world was jarring. She received the second half of her payment the next morning, delivered by a silent royal courier. The pouch was heavier than she could have imagined. It was a fortune. It was Leo's future, secure and bright. She sat on her lumpy mattress in her small, cramped apartment, the gold coins pooled in her lap, and she cried. They were tears of relief, of gratitude. But underneath it all was a strange, persistent ache, a sense of loss she couldn't name. She paid for Leo's treatments. She watched, day by day, as the color returned to his cheeks, as his rattling cough subsided, as the light of wonder returned to his eyes. She had done it. She had saved him. This was everything she had ever wanted. She should have been happy. But a part of her felt as though it had been left behind on that moonlit balcony, trapped in a moment that was too real to be forgotten. She went back to work at the Crimson Mug. The noise, the smells, the demanding patrons, it was all blessedly, painfully familiar. The ball had been a dream, a fairy tale with a contractual end date. She tried to forget the feel of his hand on her back, the surprising sadness in his eyes, the jolt of his touch. She tried to forget the king. 3 days later, he walked into the tavern. It was the middle of a slow afternoon. The place was nearly empty. He did not arrive with a royal entourage or the imposing presence of his chamberlain. He came alone. He wore simple, dark clothes, no crown, no sigils of office. He looked younger, less burdened, and utterly out of place. He hesitated in the doorway, his gaze scanning the room until it found her. Anne, who was wiping down the bar, froze, the rag still in her hand. Her heart gave that same painful lurch it had the first time she'd seen him. He walked over to the bar, his movements stiff and uncertain. He looked like a man who had never had to approach anyone in his life, who was used to the world coming to him. "Hello, Anne," he said, his voice quiet. "Your Majesty," she breathed, automatically starting to curtsy. "No," he said quickly. "Please, just Edward." He gestured vaguely at the empty stools. "May I?" She nodded, numb. He slid onto a stool, his long legs looking cramped in the small space. He looked around the tavern, at the cheap wooden tables and the dusty bottles, with a kind of detached curiosity. An awkward silence stretched between them. "What can I get for you?" she finally asked, her voice sounding unnaturally formal. I don't know," he admitted, looking at the grimy taps. "What do you recommend?" "The blood ale is cheap and will give you a headache," she said, her old bluntness returning without her permission. "I'd stick to the bottled vintage if I were you." A small smile touched his lips. "Thank you for the advice." He cleared his throat, his gaze dropping to his hands, which were resting on the bar. I wanted to ask you something." He looked up, and the raw vulnerability in his eyes made her breath catch. "I was wondering if you would be willing to take a walk with me, sometime. Not as Lady Annalise, and not as the king, just as you and me." Anne stared at him, her mind reeling. Why? Why would he be here? Why would a king seek out a waitress? The ball was over, the deal was done. This made no sense. A cold wave of suspicion washed over her. Was this another test? Another part of the game she didn't understand? "Why?" she asked, her voice sharp with mistrust. He seemed to shrink a little under her gaze, all the royal authority gone, leaving only the lonely man she had seen on the balcony. "Because," he said, his voice low and earnest, "for one night you made me feel real. Not like a king or a symbol, just a man. I haven't felt that way in longer than I can remember. And I find that I miss it. I miss you." His confession was so simple, so painfully honest, it disarmed her completely. She looked into his eyes and saw no deception, no ulterior motive. She saw only the truth. And in his truth, she recognized her own. She had felt it too, that startling, terrifying spark of reality in the midst of the grandest lie of her life. With him, she hadn't just been a waitress or a sister or a performer. She had been seen. The suspicion in her chest melted away, replaced by a feeling that was equal parts terror and hope. This was madness. A king and a waitress? It was a fairy tale, and fairy tales were for children's books, not for grimy taverns in the lower district. But the man sitting in front of her was not a character in a book. He was real, and he was asking for a chance. Slowly, she nodded. "I get off work at moonrise," she said. The smile that broke across his face was like the sun rising in a land that had only ever known night. Their courtship was a secret, whispered in the hidden corners of the sprawling city of Nocturne. Their first date was the walk he had asked for, a meandering journey through the quieter, older parts of the city as the moon climbed the sky. There were no carriages, no guards. It was just Edward and Anne. He was awkward at first, unused to navigating the world without the buffer of his title. He was fascinated by the smallest things, the workings of a street vendor's cart, the sound of a musician playing a mournful tune in a shadowed archway, the taste of the cheap, sweet blood candy she bought from a stall. She, in turn, began to see the man who had been buried beneath the crown. He had a dry, understated wit that emerged when he was relaxed. He was intensely curious, asking her 1,000 questions about her life, about Leo, about her thoughts on everything from architecture to the migratory patterns of shadow bats. He listened with an attentiveness that made her feel as if she were the most interesting person in the world. He was not just looking at her, he was seeing her. They met in a dusty, forgotten bookstore that smelled of decaying paper and forgotten stories, spending hours in a quiet corner, reading passages to each other from ancient poetry. He took her to the highest, most inaccessible rooftop of the Royal Spire one night, a place even the guards did not know, and they watched the sleeping city spread out below them like a carpet of dark jewels. In these stolen moments, the vast gulf between their worlds seemed to shrink until it was nothing more than the space between their hands. He told her about the pressures of his rule, the constant political maneuvering, the weight of a 1,000-year-old legacy. He spoke of his loneliness not as a grand tragedy, but as a simple, mundane fact, like the color of the sky. "With you," he confessed one night as they sat on a cold stone bench overlooking the city's ancient, whispering aqueducts, "the crown is just a piece of metal. The weight of it disappears. I remember that there is an Edward underneath it all." And she, in turn, found herself opening up in ways she never had before. She told him about her fears for Leo, but also her dreams for him. She spoke of the bone-deep weariness of her life, but also the small joys she found in it, the satisfaction of a perfectly poured drink, the rare beauty of a sunrise after a long shift. "With you," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper, "I don't feel like I'm constantly fighting for something. I don't feel like a caretaker or a servant. I just feel like Anne." The trust between them grew, a delicate, tenacious vine winding its way around their shared secret. The physical space between them, once so fraught with tension and unspoken rules, became a source of comfort. A brush of his hand against hers as they walked, the way he would tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture now familiar, intimate. The first time he kissed her, it was on that same rooftop, with the whole of Nocturne sleeping at their feet. It was nothing like the staged, public displays of affection they had rehearsed. It was hesitant, gentle, a question he was afraid to ask. She answered by leaning into him, her hand coming up to cup his jaw. The kiss was soft, searching, and it tasted of the cold night air and 1,000 unspoken words. It was a promise. It was real. They were falling in love, a slow, inevitable tumble into something neither of them had expected or planned for. It was a dangerous, impossible love, a fragile flame cupped in their hands against a gathering storm. They both knew it couldn't last, that their hidden world was a bubble that would one day have to burst. But in the quiet moments they stole from the world, under the watchful eye of the moon, it was easy to pretend that forever was a place they could actually reach. The storm broke on a cold, rain-lashed night in the heart of the Royal Spire. Lord Valerius, his ambition as sharp and unforgiving as his features, had not been idle. The story of the mysterious Lady Annalise of the Shadowfen had been too convenient, too perfect. He had dispatched his own agents, delved into obscure genealogies, and found nothing. The Shadowfen bloodline had died out centuries ago. The woman on the king's arm was a ghost, a fiction. And Valerius, smelling the rot of deception, had followed the trail. It had led him, impossibly, to a grimy tavern in the lower district. Edward was summoned to the council chamber. The room was cold, austere, its black marble walls seeming to absorb all warmth and light. The dozen members of the royal council were assembled, their faces grim, their postures radiating a collective, icy fury. Alistair stood near the door, his expression unreadable, but his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. Lord Valerius stood before the empty throne, his hands clasped behind his back. He was the very picture of righteous indignation. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice dripping with false deference, "we have convened on a matter of the utmost urgency, a matter that concerns the honor of the throne and the security of this kingdom." Edward walked to the dais but did not sit. He remained standing, facing them, a king before his querulous court. "Speak plainly, Valerius. My tolerance for your theatrics is thin tonight." Valerius's eyes glittered. "Very well. We have made inquiries into the background of your betrothed, the Lady Annalise." He let the name hang in the air, heavy with sarcasm. "It will perhaps not surprise you to learn that she does not exist." A murmur went through the room. Edward's expression remained impassive, but a cold dread began to pool in his stomach. "The woman you presented to this court, the woman you intend to make your queen," Valerius continued, his voice rising, "is a fraud, a commoner, a tavern waitress you hired to play a part." He slammed a thin file down on the council table. It was filled with reports, witness statements, a crudely sketched portrait of Anne in her tavern apron. The evidence was undeniable. The secret was out. The chamber erupted. Cries of "treason" and "disgrace" echoed off the marble walls. Duchess Isolde looked as if she might faint from sheer outrage. "You have made a mockery of this council," Valerius thundered, his face flushed with triumph. "You have endangered the kingdom with this childish deception. You were played by a common charlatan, a gold digger from the dregs of the city." Edward listened to their outrage, their accusations. He looked at their cold, calculating faces, at the fury that was born not of honor, but of thwarted ambition. And he felt nothing. Their anger was meaningless. Their world of political games and strategic marriages felt like a distant, irrelevant memory. All he could think of was Anne, her warmth, her laughter, the fierce, protective love in her eyes when she spoke of her brother, the way she made him feel real. He held up a hand. The room fell silent, the council members taken aback by his utter calm. "She is not a charlatan," Edward said, his voice quiet but carrying a steel that cut through the tension. "And I was not played." He looked directly at Valerius, his gaze unwavering. "Every word you have spoken is true. I hired her. I created the lie of Lady Annalise." Gasps rippled through the room. Alistair closed his eyes, a silent prayer or a final resignation. "I did it to free myself from the chains you sought to place on me," Edward continued, his voice gaining strength. "You sought to use my marriage as a political tool, to sell my future for trade routes and influence. You have never cared for my happiness, only for the power the crown affords you." He stepped down from the dais, moving to stand in the center of the room, an equal among them, yet radiating an authority they could not touch. "You are right about one thing. It began as a deception, a business arrangement. But it became something else." He thought of their secret walks, of the shared laughter in the dusty bookstore, of the kiss on the rooftop. "Her name is Anne," he said, the name a shield and a banner. "She is not a lady of noble blood. She is a waitress. She is also the most honorable, courageous, and compassionate person I have ever known. She has more integrity in her little finger than this entire council possesses." He swept his gaze across their stunned faces. "You accuse me of disgracing the throne, but the real disgrace would be to bow to your demands. The real disgrace would be to sacrifice a love that is true and real for a union that is hollow and political." "This is madness," Valerius sputtered. You would choose a commoner over your duty? Over your kingdom? She is my duty, Edward said, the realization hitting him with the force of a revelation. Loving her is not a dereliction of my duty. It is the fulfillment of it, because she has reminded me what it means to be more than just a crown. She has reminded me how to be a man. He looked at Valerius, his eyes blazing with a power that had nothing to do with his title. The arrangement with Lady Seraphina is cancelled. The matter is closed. I have made my choice. He turned his back on them, on their sputtering rage and their thwarted ambitions, and walked towards the door. He had defied his council, shattered 1,000 years of tradition, and likely thrown his kingdom into political chaos. But as he strode from the chamber, he had never felt more like a king. The rumors reached the lower district like a foul smog, whispered in alleys and shouted on street corners. The king's betrothed was an impostor, a commoner, a tavern girl. Anne heard them at work, her hands shaking so badly she dropped a tray of goblets, the sound of shattering crystal echoing the breaking of her heart. They knew. Everyone knew. She fled the tavern, running through the winding streets to the fragile sanctuary of her apartment. She locked the door, leaning against it, her breath coming in ragged sobs. It was over. Of course it was over. It was always going to end this way. She was a fool to have believed, even for a moment, that a fairy tale could be real. She braced herself for the inevitable. At best, she would be cast aside, a forgotten embarrassment. At worst, the royal guard would come for her, to silence the king's mistake permanently. She waited for hours, watching the shadows lengthen in her small room, each footstep in the corridor outside a new spike of terror. When the knock finally came, it was soft, hesitant, not the heavy fist of a guard. She opened the door a crack. It was him, Edward. He stood in the dim hallway, his hair damp from the rain, his face pale and drawn. He wasn't wearing his crown, but he wore a look of fierce, unwavering determination. "May I come in?" he asked softly. She opened the door wider, and he stepped inside, filling her small room with his presence. He looked at her, at the fear and misery on her face, and his own expression crumpled with regret. "Anne, I am so sorry," he began. "I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted to expose you to this." "It's all right," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper, wrapping her arms around herself. "I knew the risks. The contract is over. You don't have to apologize." She couldn't meet his eyes. "You should go, before someone sees you here." "I'm not leaving," he said. He took a step, closer, and she flinched back. The movement, small as it was, seemed to wound him more than any sword. "They know everything, Anne. The council. I told them." She finally looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief and a new, sharper fear. "You what? Why?" "Because I was done with the lies," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I stood before them, and they called you a charlatan, a gold digger. They insulted you. And I realized I would not stand for it. I will not have them speak of the woman I love that way." The words hung in the air between them. The woman I love. "I told them the truth," he went on, his gaze intense, unwavering. "I told them how it started, and I told them what it has become. I told them that I have made my choice." He took another slow step towards her, his hands open at his sides. "I did not come here to end things, Anne. I came to begin them." He was in front of her now, so close she could feel the warmth from his body. He reached out, his hand gently tilting her chin up so she had to look at him. "The charade is over. The lies are done. All that is left is the truth. And the truth is, I love you. I love you more than my crown, more than my kingdom, and I cannot, will not, live my life without you." he took a shaky breath. I am not asking you to be my pretend girlfriend anymore. I am asking you to be my wife, to be my queen. Tears streamed down Anne's face, but they were no longer tears of fear. This was impossible. It was madness. But it was also real. The truth she saw in his eyes was the most real thing she had ever known. The world outside would be furious. The council would plot against them. Their lives would be a constant battle. But in that moment, none of it mattered. She surged forward, her arms wrapping around his neck, and kissed him. It was a kiss of desperation and relief, of fear and fierce joy. It was the end of the fairy tale and the beginning of the story. Days later, she stood beside him in the great throne room. The court was assembled, a sea of hostile, whispering faces. Edward did not dress her in silks and jewels. She wore a simple, elegant gown, but she was unmistakably herself. Anne. He led her to the dais, his hand holding hers, a warm, solid anchor in the storm. He did not address the court with a prepared speech. He simply looked at them, his gaze sweeping over the dukes and duchesses, the lords and ladies. "This is Anne," he said, his voice ringing with a calm, unshakable authority. "She is a woman of no title and no great bloodline. She is also my heart and my conscience. She is your queen." He turned to her, ignoring the gasps and murmurs of the stunned court. He held up a simple silver coronet, unadorned with the massive jewels of state, but beautiful in its elegant simplicity. He gently placed it on her head. It was cool against her skin and lighter than she could have imagined. He leaned in, his lips brushing her ear. "Are you ready?" he whispered. She looked out at the sea of uncertain faces, at the long, difficult road ahead. Then she looked at him, at the love and trust in his eyes. She squeezed his hand. "Yes," she whispered back, "I am." Their hands were linked, no longer a performance for a watchful audience, but a simple, profound truth. A king and a waitress. A love born from a beautiful charade, now more real than any crown, any throne, any kingdom. And together, they faced their new beginning.